that I need to clarify just a few things. One is the IPID and the further input from the Secretariat. There's been discussions with IPID. They are here. They've asked that you directly approach them. Their papers in the folder. And also IPID reassured us that one of the key things they would have looked at in their paper is how do you deal with police officers and their responsibility often after the fact, the discharge of a firearm and all of that. And a lot of you as key stakeholders probably have more than just a rudimentary understanding of that. So there is the IPID environment, their papers is here, and they are approachable and invite further input from them. You've heard from the Secretariat, Mr. Faisal Ali, who would have been presenting the paper specifically on what the Secretariat is doing around firearms. There's a large section in their presentation from yesterday that already covers their further focus and what they intend doing, and you've heard from the acting secretary around the Secretariat's plan with the whole firearm regime, and they would and will continue to not only do research but invites collaborations and engagement around their particular program. So I needed to just clarify that because folks were asking, and I mustn't say that folks were asking about those two papers, so they are there. So thank you for that. Thank you, as we said, for your patience and your indulgence. We're on the homeward stretch. One of the key things we would like to do is to reflect back on the 2 days. And I'm going to invite you in a moment to share how you're feeling. And let's hear from some of those people who've been particularly quiet. And I may pick on you, if that's okay. But we want to hear how you're feeling at this time. What for you maybe is unresolved, unsaid, and also maybe for you, what is a highlight before we start getting into the road ahead. Is that okay? Before we go anywhere though, Gerrit has asked for some space, so I'll just give over to him for a short input.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity of addressing this gathering. This morning, my colleague next to me was giving you the happy news in terms of the 8 medals that our teams won in the States at the World Championships, and the 11 medals that we scooped up here at the Africa Championships. Perhaps I should have started by saying I'm Gerrit Doctor. I'm the Regional Director of the International Practical Shooting Confederation. I'm also the Chairman of the South African Practical Shooting Association. And I also have a mandate to represent the South African Shooting Sports Confederation by the President Henny Jacobs. Now there are 17 shooting sports associations affiliated to the South African Shooting Sports Confederation. The reason why I mention again the 8 medals that we won at the World Shoot and the 11 medals that we've just got in at the Africa Champs is that it's proof positive that our development programs are working. We've had people such as the French World Champ speak highly of our programs, and we are really, really very chuffed about that. However, I come with a mandate, and I would need to ask and perhaps call it an appeal, perhaps call it a conditioning statement. But the mandate that I have from the President of the South African Shooting Sports Confederation is very, very simple. Please do not touch anything as far as Section 16 is concerned. It works for the shooting sports, and we would love it to remain as is. Secondly, Martin Hood has already alluded to it in terms of the government's structure with the SA Police. I noticed that the shooting sports is totally absent from this as well. I think that's a glaring omission, and that needs to be corrected. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gerrit. Well, let's invite folks to share with us how you're feeling at this time. What do you think is maybe unsaid, unresolved? What for you particularly may have been a highlight, a low light? If there was any, before we start mapping the road ahead and looking at summaries and broad issues of consensus and content that will further inform the portfolio committee and the secretariat. So should I start picking on people? Paul, I'm not going to pick on you, but you can start us off.
Thanks very much. Sorry, on behalf of the Sports Shooting Forum, it's becoming apparent that what we're dealing with here is a societal problem, and as we all know, sports are one of the elements of society that are the most positive elements of society, that reinforce good behavior, that teach people teamwork, that teach people to be good citizens, to be good members of society. So it seems critical to me, being that we sit at the nexus of this, because we are the shooting sports, that the shooting sports play a role in this, that they play a part in this. We have the ability to extend out into the community outreach programs, which nobody else has. We already have sports shooting associations everywhere. In every little town, in every little dorp, there'll be a hunting association, or there'll be somebody that does some form of sports shooting. So it seems to me critical that we utilize these resources and harness these resources to embark on training, to embark on familiarization, firearm safety, because firearms are around in society. They're everywhere. They're not always documented or under the control of licensed firearm owners. They appear everywhere. So train people what to do when they come across a firearm. We have the capacity to do that. We have the ability to do, we have the will to do that. In partnership with the SAPS, as we heard this morning from the Minister, the Deputy Minister, and the members of the Portfolio Committee that we've interacted with, we can accomplish a hell of a lot together. It's all about building, it's all about trying to create a better environment, building towards a better future for us all. Thank you.
So let's take that as something that thanks Nadine. let's take that as something that I think we'll all share, is that we share a common responsibility in addressing this concern, that we all have access, and that one of the things we recognize as one of the backbones and fundamentals of this is responsible citizenship. And especially responsibility around firearms, and then firearm safety. And in this we can all play a role. We have knowledge, we have insight, we have access. So if we're in accord with that, we will just let that stand as something that we could all offer and make a contribution to. I said I'm going to start picking on people. You're not one of the people I want to pick. Sorry. Let me go to people clear over there. I don't know, maybe you're with the media or something, and maybe you don't have something to say. No, you don't have to squirt away, young lady. I saw you, but you were not the one I was going to pick on, but I can start with you. You have nothing to say. How do you feel today? Just say something, don't worry. Say hi, my name is, I'm from.
Hi, my name is Tasneem. I'm from the Legal Resources Center. We were just invited based on the fact that we have an interest in the current situation regarding policing. And just as a bystander and just observing what was said and what the presentations were about, it was a learning process. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it. All the comments, all that was said as well. I'm relatively new to anything that's got to do with law, so I appreciate the invitation and everything that I learned. Yes.
Thank you, and we're pleased you accepted the invitation. Can we bump to the lady on your left who's beavering away there at something?
Hi Hi there, I'm a journalist. I'm just here to observe in a thoroughly neutral fashion. Thanks.
When it comes to these issues, no one are neutral. You are either affected. There's no such thing as neutrality. You have a view, you express that, and especially as journalists, you propagate it. So maybe you will share an observation with us, otherwise you will not be let out here today. We have those people, they wear white shirts, they're not in the room at the moment, but you know, we can ask the Honorable Bierkman to organize. So just, come on, at the top of your head, what are you sharing with folks? Tell us.
Arrived, so I'd be happy to give a contribution later.
And we'll hold you to that. Thank you. Can we go to the back row beyond Bilkis behind you? I know, come on, you guys from the Secretariat, say something. Before I pick on you by name. Oh, she's so shy.
Good afternoon, honorable members and colleagues. The 2 days really were an informative part for us as the Secretariat, and particularly from a partnerships perspective. It shows really that guns cannot be about policing alone. These have to do with the communities that we live in. It has to do with the people that we interact in, whether as government officials, as police, or as part of the community policing forum. Always around us there are guns, and it shows that within that space of guns, the safety of our children and the safety of communities is important. That's where the partnerships comes from. It does not have to be about somebody securing their territory. It has to do with the overall safety within which we interact and within which we envisage our kids to be living. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Becky.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, I'm quite interested in the issue of guns because it doesn't seem to be covered by the Firearm Control Act. I'm speaking under correction, but perhaps if we could get some insight into that. But what has been particularly interesting for me, it is the fact that we are diagnosing a problem, yet we don't have data that will enable us to base our discussion on. I think the presentation by Guy Lamb yesterday scratched the surface about what is the problem, but in his presentation he could not conclusively say this is the situation because of the lack of data. I think that there's a need, Chairperson, to look into that matter and make the data available, particularly to people who can assist us in this regard. The last point, Chairperson, I think in a gathering like this, what becomes important is that we must, at the end of the session, answer the question, so what? And if we answer that question, we must answer it with the purpose of ensuring that whatever the outcome of this collective must improve the life of people who, as we are seated here, are affected, regardless of our individual interests. Because we are discussing about something that is affecting the lives of many people in South Africa, so we must take that into consideration. Hence, my appeal, Chairperson, is that if that question can be answered, that will be one thing that one can take home as a part course. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Can we ask our gun-free folks to turn around and invite the folks behind them to please say something?
Thank you, Chairperson. The name is Joseph Manuel, and I represent the South African Policing Union. I think one of the things that stood out for me was the address by the Deputy Minister earlier today. Starting out by saying that they admit there are problems within the system was a way to recovery, was to get us somewhere. Not to sit there and put blaming each other, but she definitely made it clear. And one other thing is that we sit here as fellow South Africans, and the cry has been throughout the 2 days that we need to work together to address this problem. And only by working together we will be able collectively to make the difference. Thank you, Chair.
And we thank SAPU for being here. Thank you very much. We've heard from the board. Should we go back to the back? Mr. Anthony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm from Business Against Crime, and we promote responsible ownership, and that's our stance on firearms. And I think we should address how do we control illegal firearms, and that's where the problem lies. I doubt whether a robbery or heist is committed by a legal firearm. So most of these are illegal firearms used in robberies or heist. And I'm very pleased to see that this is a collective approach to address this crime in South Africa. But what I would like to see in here today is the CBOs on the Cape Flats. They're plagued by these illegal ownership guns, like specifically here in Menenberg. And what will their take be on this whole issue of illegal ownership? Thank you very much.
So, Andrew, your appeal to the Portfolio Committee is to say, hold on, you also need to be listening, as you do, and continue to listen to people directly affected by gun violence, whether it's on gang-related gun violence, whether it's in the home, amongst others.
I would really like that, sir.
Thank you. Can you invite the two young people sitting on your right to also make a contribution?
Thank you. Since you gently forced me to speak, my name is Sean Bolhuis. And this is to the Honourable Beekman. We are from the Tshwane Metro Police. We are also here. We're from the capital city.
Welcome. We know you're far from home, but
thank you.
Yeah, half of Parliament is there.
But let me not comment on behalf of my organization. Since we are a police organization, we align to SAPS. But let me give you my personal opinion on the 2 days quickly. I think in South Africa we've become excellent speakers on topics, but I'm not impressed by how people speak and what they say. As a government official, I want to see people work. So I want to see people say things and then put it into action. So if we can, what we have discussed in the last 2 days, put into action, practical, simplistic, workable, without compromising safety and security, but without compromising the Constitution as well, I'll be impressed. But I'm not impressed by a lot of talking. Having said that as well, we must also be careful of over-regulating the firearm industry or guns, because then, for that matter, we might as well start regulating BMWs. Because if you look at how BMW drivers drive on our roads, then obviously we need to start regulating that as well. So what I'm trying to say is, let's have what we've discussed put in place, administration, regulation, put the legislation in place, or it's in place, get it right, get it working. But it was constantly mentioned here over the 2 days, and I fully agree with the different speakers. It is the people condition that we have to address, not necessarily the gun issue. Yes, we must have that regulation, we must have the administration in place. But the people issue is the real issue. It's people that commit crimes. It's people that drive BMWs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. if you're offering yourself, we're going to start coming to those who offer themselves. Okay.
Mr. Process Leader, thank you very much. If you allow me the opportunity, I've got a small message that I would like to convey to the Portfolio Committee. When looking at firearms and the use and licensing of firearms, I believe you also have to look at it from an economic point of view. I have on a couple of occasions now already said I represent the South African Hunters Association. From research that was done by the Northwest University, the last study results that is available is for 2013. The total economic contribution to the gross domestic product in the country, the total expenditure through hunting in 2013 was 6.3 billion rands. That amount of money was spent by an estimated 200,000 people that went hunting and went hunting to consume the meat in that particular year. Audrey Kutzhoff is present here. She represents the professional hunters. If you want to add to that, the figure that I remember from the study is 1.1 billion for trophy hunting in the same year, Audrey. So you talk of 7.4 billion rand spent in the country by hunters, both consuming hunters and trophy hunters. The bulk of that amount was spent in rural areas, on farms and in platteland, not in the cities, where people are really poor, where there's limited working opportunities and where the opportunity to earn income is not very big. So if we think of limiting firearms to the extent that people cannot hunt anymore, you should know that you take 6.3 billion out of the economy, most probably by now closer to 7.5 billion, because this information is already 2 years old. Coming at it from another angle, my association alone, I know, takes a lot of trouble to teach people to shoot. I had a calculation done, and just the value of the ammunition shot away in any 1 year in my association alone is estimated at 12 million rand. Now, Stephen told you a little earlier there are 35 hunters associations, and some of the other guys here told you how many sport shooting associations there are. I guess we will most likely not be far from wrong if we say somewhere between 75 and 100 million rand per annum spent on ammunition. Now this is done legally, it's done with firearms that are licensed legally. And that is the reason why we would continue arguing that you've not got to be unreasonable with the process by means of which you manage firearm ownership in the country. We do not object legislation on regulating firearm ownership, but you've got to allow us to continue doing so legally, both for sport as well as for hunting purposes. If not, there's a huge risk of reducing the amount of money available to quite a number of people in the country. Thank you so much.
And thank you for that.
Me.
Thank you. It got me confused here. I have one big concern. We're not opposed to regulating and controlling firearms. The biggest concern I have, looking at the proposed amendments and listening to some of the figures that are bandied around, financial figures, for instituting these, the ballistics and the microdot, is the cost. We're looking at some, I've heard figures ranging from 4 to 8 billion rand being spent on this. And by the same, in the same breath, everybody here acknowledges, from the police through to the forum and everyone else, acknowledges that the Firearms Control Act is in a shambles. Would it not be better for us to spend that money, 4 to 8 billion rand, on fixing the wrongs, rather than spending more money and creating more wrongs? That's all. Thank you.
I can take my little prerogative that I have and say that the Firearms Control Amendments Act is to be discussed in public forums and through submissions in the process going forward, so that we don't spend too much of the time that's left concentrating on that. I think we understand and we acknowledge, and I think the Portfolio Committee has heard, and if they've not heard, let's say it again, that the stakeholder and organized sectors will engage them and have very particular and quite strong and fairly enunciated and articulated views on this issue. Goed genoeg? Okay. So they will hear this and they will understand this if they have not done that to date. So they can expect you to send your best folks to do so. What we would really like to do is focus on how do we accept responsibility for what there is. There's a current state of affairs. You've all said that you have particular expertise and ideas to bring to bear. What is it that we're going to do? How do we walk out of here and reconcile the fact that we've begun to impact the lives of ordinary South Africans who are directly affected by violence of all kinds, including gun violence? And I'm saying that deliberately. Okay? So don't come back and say, it's not just gun violence, it's knife and this and that. We've acknowledged that. Ons is eens daarmee. Is that okay? Goed so.
That was confusing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honourable Facilitator. It's a good thing he wasn't here this morning. I want to tie in with your very valuable input in trying to channel us into a constructive direction. And I want to pull in on what you said in terms of we have to be responsible. We have to come up with practical solutions for the road forward in order to inform ourselves and, very importantly, to inform the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee in order to make informed decisions that are the correct decisions that are based on the correct data. We have all, through the last 2 days, been hung up sometimes on specific data points. Is it 5%? Is it 5.5%? Who knows? Nobody knows. We can all agree that, and I think we have agreed through these last 2 days, that the data is lacking, severely lacking. Now, from the Portfolio Committee's perspective, they don't have the time to go and research all of this on their own. So they're looking to us to inform them. And if we give them the incorrect data, I believe we are doing the country a disservice. I believe it is dishonest, and to push a certain agenda that is not what is expected from a citizen from South Africa. I would suggest that in order to gather the data so that there are proper studies to inform the Portfolio Committee, independent research is conducted by independent bodies, which hopefully we can all agree to, and we make sure that they get on with their jobs, get the data, and hopefully that will inform the Portfolio Committee so that they can apply their minds and come to an equitable solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I asked a very specific question today of the Deputy Minister, and I got a very pleasing answer. I already feel a lot more comfortable that I can start thinking about more creative things than saving my guns. We meet quite often, we meet with the police on a regular basis, but as I've said, up until now, mostly we focus on practically trying to reduce bottlenecks in the specific administration of the Act. But those same relationships can certainly be unpacked a lot more from us as responsible parts of civil society. The Act, in actual fact, calls upon accredited associations to further both the aims and objectives of the Act, both the spirit and the letter of the Act. And for us, in order to do true justice to that responsibility as accredited associations, we must look further than trying to find ways to get firearm licenses through the system for our member base. We need to look at the spirit of the Act in terms of all of these other issues, the violent crime that's happening in the country, social ills that occur in poorer areas, development, transformation goals. I have no doubt that if our working relationships happen more often and on a more general plane, we will engage closer and closer as friends than as, let's just say, trying to solve problems bottleneck on a negative way. And I've no doubt that if we start getting made aware of some of the areas where we can come in and step in and help, we will also look for projects that we can get involved in, development projects, supportive projects. Firearm owners are incredibly economically active people. Most of them have to have a certain minimum wealth level. We are kind of part of the engine of the economy. Your 2030 goals are going to be driven largely out of the type of people that firearm owners are. There's doctors, there's ministers of religion of all faiths. There are all sorts of professionals involved. There are educators involved in firearm ownership. We have people from all walks of life. It's a stated fact, and we can blame this, I'm sure, on Van Riebeeck, that at this stage, the biggest percentage of firearm owners, especially in the recreational ownership side of things, still remain white people. But that's changing, and it's changing rapidly. There's no doubt about it, as more and more black folk find recreational use of firearms, let's say collecting, sport shooting, hunting, etc., you might start to demystify some of the fear that sits in huge communities about firearms. There will be opportunities to engage properly and solve a lot of that kind of cultural disconnect. But certainly we stand ready. We have been for 10 years engaging, and we stand ready to engage further and possibly on far more positive manners in future. That would be the commitment from the hunting community specifically, and I think I speak for most firearm associations in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludwig. And then we'll come to Mr. Walsh before we go all the way up there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and honourable members of the Portfolio Committee. I read this brochure last night. I'm an avid reader, and I would just like to quote something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is, "The sun heals the divisions of the past, improves the quality of life of all South Africans." End of quote. This kept me awake a lot last night, and it addresses the issue of doing research and being impartial. I have been doing my research, and because I'm a gun owner, it could be deemed that I'm impartial. That I'm partial, that I'm not impartial, that I have a biased view. I've heard personally a lot of comments the last 2 days about research. I have asked people to supply me with information, and all I've had up till now was to just look at what other people published, and that can be seen as just criticizing and complaining. And from my side, I would like to say that whatever gets given to me will be treated confidentiality, and I will submit whatever I've done to anybody, and then they can say to me, well, you know, you've made a mistake here, and we can debate it. On a personal level, I really wish to thank whoever invited me here. That was a huge concern for me. And I will go back to my constituency and tell him that the voices of the ordinary people in South Africa are being heard at the highest level. And I thank you all for that. Very thanks.
Thank you, Ludwig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and honorable members. I'm Sambo from SIRA. From the 2 days that we've been here, what I could detect is there's been so much discussion, but what I've realized is nothing has been mentioned from maybe manufacturers or dealers who have lost firearms. So predominantly there's been your individual owners and maybe institution, jurisdiction person there and there. So what I could see is, I think what we need to do is education, training more, because everything goes back to fitness of a person to really, are you really fit or can you really safeguard your firearm? And the other thing of which the Commissioner today mentioned not enough was the issue of what happens to the firearms that are being handed in. Maybe the problem is the process of distracting them takes long. That's why hence you find that some of them will fall back to the criminal world. So maybe that should be addressed at the time frame when those firearms are handed in, how long does it take to be destroyed? Finally, one thing that is not being mentioned too much is the issue of media. We've got this problem of firearms, more especially illegal firearms, but one, if you see the movies that we see today in South Africa that are produced locally, 80% of them is about violence. There's a firearm being used there. So we're not promoting a culture of where people know there's no violence, but it's like violence is what sells. So we really need to include even the media to say, or the film industry, what are they doing to help in this problem that we're having of violence in South Africa? Because if we can try to promote movies or films that are violence-free, then surely we will be educating our kids and the community that we don't really need a firearm to protect yourself. Thank you.
I'm also later going to invite Nadine, who was chatting to me over tea or lunch, about this whole thing about where people hand in firearms and the loss of confidence in our state institutions, for example, in terms of handing firearms there, and that's not getting any easier. So she had some specific ideas about that that is worth listening to, so I may invite her to say something. Advocate Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, quite a lot has this morning specifically been said about the issues of the use of firearms in crime, and it is obviously a concern to many people. It is a serious concern to most of us. Many of us are multiple firearms owners, and whatever a person is doing irresponsibly with a firearm affects us all. It not only affects victims, it not only affects people in the community, certainly it does, but it affects us all. What has also clearly come out from a number of speakers this afternoon is that one must very carefully look at specific purpose firearms. Generally, one can draw a very clear distinction about those people who acquire firearms for self-defense purposes. And what I have picked up yesterday and this morning is that in many cases, those are the firearms that create problems for many, because those are generally the firearms that are stolen. Very seldom that you would find firearms from collectors, from hunters, and from sporting people being used in crime. Not to say that that cannot happen, it can happen, certainly, but generally it does not happen. One would also, in the second analysis, find that those people who have a dedicated status, who are private collectors and whoever and whatever, they are generally very responsible because of the huge investment that they have made in their firearms, and they know that they stand to lose a lot financially and otherwise if something happens to their firearms. So I think a very clear distinction could be drawn between these two groups, and I think possibly for the first time the Portfolio Committee realized that that exists. Not that they did not realize that before, but I think it has been emphasized over and over again. The third point I would like to make, I wanted to talk about research, but I think enough has been said about joining hands and joining resources for research. But the one research project that is probably going to be the most complex is the one about the illegal trade in firearms. You know, it's easy to do research regarding the lawful firearms. In other words, those for which licenses exist. Where there are no licenses, where firearms have been manufactured in a private garage, in a backyard, in Tugela Ferry, and wherever else, it's very, very difficult to do research in that regard. Not every person is going to admit to being in possession of an unlicensed firearm. So the research is going to be very complicated, and one needs to be extremely cautious as to how to analyze the results of that research. But I think from the South African Gun Owners Association and the Collectors Associations, we believe that is a vitally important facet of whatever research needs to be done. The second last, or the penultimate point that I would like to make is that I think also for the first time we have moved much closer to that aspect that I have first raised in 1985 already, and that is the licensing of the person vis-a-vis the registration of the firearm. It is still a matter that can be fine-tweaked at this stage, but the principle, I think, has been carried over fairly significantly, fairly forcefully, and I don't think there is a doubt regarding the principal issue. And then the last point that I would like to raise is the one that Gun Free South Africa and various others have raised regarding amnesty. I once again want to say, despite the fact that it has been applauded as a success in the sense that illegally possessed firearms are removed from society, but also secondly, firearms that are not wanted are removed from society. SAGA would favor an amnesty, although we have certain doubts as to the functionality thereof and the security in that regard. I think there is too much information currently floating around about firearms that have been surrendered, that have been used in crime, that are being used in crime, and I believe that guarantee needs to be given that that is not going to happen. And under those circumstances, we shall certainly support a request or a demand for an amnesty. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll be remiss to not try to at least begin to summarize some of these points. So the question of dealing once again with public perception is going to be critical, whether it's for an amnesty and or just the nature of the body of research. Is it credible data, access to that information and the like? And I think one of the critical things that's been present with us for 2 days is this question where we put things like either or. I think we're moving closer to both and. Rather than making everything a false dichotomy that you either must do this or that. You can do both. And one of those things is the registration, the licensing of the person and the registration of the firearm, for example. They can coexist. And there are other areas where we have created this dichotomy, and yet it's a false one. And we need to start breaking down those false dichotomies so that in fact we can do both and not begin to think that it's one or the other. So thank you again for that. I want to move up towards you and towards Adele. I wanted to keep them quiet. So should I go to the ladies first and then come back to the special advisor and then finally go to attorney who's now become Dr. Wood? All in 2 days. I mean, like, seriously. Please, and then we'll go to Adele and then skip to this side of the room.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. I think just for the latecomers, or the people who weren't here earlier when I spoke, I'm also representing the hunters in South Africa from the Hunters Forum. My name is Audrey Kutzhoff. You asked us what we got out of today and yesterday and also the way forward. What I got out of this most is that we moved a little bit away from the us and them situation. I think we found a lot of commonality when we saw Martin and Adele yesterday there at the front, and even today during discussions. There's a lot of things that we share the same concern on this side of the table as many people have shared their concerns on that side of the table. The one thing that's very important, what we identified here, was the role of the societal challenges and the impact that crime has on the society rather than the gun culture. And from our constituency, and I'm talking on behalf of all responsible hunters and all responsible sport shooters and all responsible firearm owners, we wouldn't have had and we wouldn't have owned firearms if we were not responsible. So we will take your challenge forward and we will carry the message across wherever we can and educate people in responsible handling of firearms. The way forward, we heard today that the Central Firearm Registrar, over the last 2 days, we've heard how many times they've just been punched on the cheek, left, right and center, and they took it gracefully. They're sitting here and they actually haven't said a word. But they cannot do the job if they don't have the capacity. And I was delighted today to listen to the Deputy Minister actually saying that she has realized what's going on and how they're going to give them the capacity. If we want to enforce responsible farm ownership, we need to know that it can be enforced. The Act can be enforced, and that cannot be done the way that the CFR is being constituted at the moment. The last thing, we're prepared to take hands and work together, but we need to build trust again. And that is trust from firearm owners to its government and everybody out there, but that's also trust from the Cabinet, from the Portfolio Committee, and from the public out there in us as responsible firearm owners. Thank you.
You lot saved yourself. You were not going to applaud Adriek. I would have admonished you from up here and used the speaker's prerogative to say you better clap your hands. Thank you, Adriek. Takes a woman, as they say. So shall we go to a man again? Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I think two very simple points. John has partly stolen my thunder, but let me just echo them in very simple terms. I think in terms of immediate things that can be done going forward, firstly, we need to get a far better understanding of the illegal firearms economy. That is where the research needs to be directed immediately. And obviously that needs to be independent and so forth. Other people have already spoken to that. But if we don't understand the illegal firearms economy or have a better understanding of it, we don't really understand the problem we're trying to solve. So that, I think, is an absolute priority. The other thing that we can do immediately is try to strengthen the competency processes, make better use of Section 102, Section 103, and so forth. The key to all this is ensuring that unfit people do not have possession of firearms. That's a key component. And at the moment, we know that that is not being adequately implemented from an operational perspective. There are not adequate background checks and so forth. And I think as a society as a whole, we have an interest in ensuring that that is done. Because if at the end of the day, you have unfit people being declared competent, everything else you are doing is probably going to be a waste of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Facilitator. I think over the last couple of days, some of us have got used to the sound of our voices too much. So I'll try and be brief. I think first of all, and I'm going to start off being all touchy, feely, etc., by saying a thank you to everybody here. I think that we've moved quite far forward in terms of a better understanding of our respective positions and our respective challenges. We've been approached by a number of different organizations who've indicated, and particularly SAPS in particular, who've indicated that they've heard our call from security industry in particular for better engagement. But, and there's always a but, I look around today and I see really only one familiar face, and that's Adele, going back to 1997, where these debates occurred in 1997. We're now 18 years, 17 years down the line, and I hear the same things time and time again. And I think it's time to move forward, as my colleague from Swanee Metro mentioned. Talk is very good, but action is really where the rubber hits the road. We need to stop talking. We've I think, got the message across to the Portfolio Committee loud and clear what the basic problems are. I hate to say, I told you so, but this happened back in 2000. And we were ignored. I'm happy that we're not being ignored now, but the same problems remain as 15 years ago. Let's get into action and please sort them out. We can't keep on talking.
Since you've just been named.
Thanks, thanks, Eldred. I think there's been a lot of same stuff, but I think the more interesting is that there have been some really useful discussions and some interesting discussions. And I just want to pull out sort of 2 or 3 of what Gun Free South Africa sees as emerging consensus. I think for us, as gun control advocates, a very significant shift has happened in this meeting, and that is a recognition, and it's a global principle and norm that was negotiated at the UN about 10 years ago. And it's been reiterated by gun owners several times in this forum, is that you license the person and you register the gun. Our current act does that, but there's often been quite a lot of resistance to that. So it's about deeming someone fit and proper, but you recognize that the weapon itself needs to be registered. And I think that's a really important step forward. I think to add that I think there would appear to be differences around this. It's people who commit crime, it's not the guns, which is precisely why you need a regulatory regime, because you need to regulate who owns what weapon for which purpose. And again, that's a sort of basic principle underpinning most gun laws across the world. So in a way, it's a plea to move beyond the kind of it's people who kill, not guns, because I think the law recognizes that, and that's why you need regulation. You need to regulate people and ownership of weapons. I think the second emerging consensus, and I think in response to the Tshwane police officer, is I think there's a good consensus around the need for a national firearms amnesty. I think there's emerging consensus around no questions asked. We recognize that that's a big step forward for this country, but it means we've got something very concrete on the table, and we can begin to kind of hammer out some of the details of what that would look like for this context. And I think there are some useful international examples. And I think the third consensus is the need for accurate record keeping, and not just good data and accurate data, but the sharing of data in the public domain so that we can develop an analysis of where are the problems. And it's not about blaming. So if the Committee of Inquiry into Corrupt Practices of Firearm Dealers and Firearm Institutions, which was set up in 2013 by then Minister Nathi Mthethwa, if it's finding that a major problem of leakage and diversion and corruption is CFR officers, we need to know that, not because we want to say CFR officers are bad, because we want to say if that's where the problem lies, what are the solutions? What do we have to be doing something different in order to stop the leakage? And the fact that our question was deliberately not answered this morning is a concern, because it's what is in that report that we cannot see, that we may not know about. That report has been around for the last year. So as much as there's an emerging consensus around the need for accurate data and information and an analysis to help us develop effective and relevant interventions, our concern is, one, the lack of transparency around that Committee of Inquiry report. The other is the huge discrepancies between loss and theft that we have. Finally, and this I think is an area where there hasn't been sufficient voice, partly because of who's in the room. But when we think of gun control, we need to think beyond firearm owners and their interests, and they are end users of the Act. That the Act is geared towards controlling and regulating the gun-owning fraternity. And the gentleman from the SA Hunters mentioned the cost in terms of positive terms for our country. We need to balance that with the cost of gun death and injury. It is 6 billion annually. That is what it costs us annually. Lives lost and rehabilitation, medical emergency services, etc. And we need to be also keeping that in mind about the enormous cost of gun violence to our society. And that's, I think, largely been absent in this discussion. And then I guess finally, just once again, as I said yesterday in my, when I was up on the panel, is to really thank the Portfolio Committee on Police and the Civilian Secretariat for bringing us together, for being bold enough to put people with very different views and perspectives on this in the same room. And Eldred, because I've got the last word, you have been an extraordinary facilitator. Thank you for making it a safe space and for encouraging us to speak out, but also reminding us about being respectful and what we're about here. And essentially, we're about saving lives.
Thank you. Now I'll take my other side and pick on people again. Bernard. Thank you, Adele.
Eldred, it was...
Sorry, and Valdi, the only reason I didn't come to you is because you were about to put your tea to your mouth, so you next.
It wasn't my intention to say anything, but I have made a few observations. I think the one observation relates to Professor Van As of Red Cross Hospital, UCT, pertaining to the impact of the gun culture on society, but more specifically the damage that it can cause to children and adults, I would like to say. But what would be interesting is to look at the cost implication on society, but more specifically the impact that the different firearms will have on these shootings, especially in the community, and more specifically on the Cape Flats. The second observation that I would like to note is the issue pertaining to the Deputy Minister, boldness to indicate that there's a problem pertaining to the data integrity, pertaining to the firearm registry or whatever you call it, during an address. Now my question is, especially in terms of the second observation, if that is a challenge pertaining to the firearms, in terms of data integrity, how does it relate to crime stats? But I know that is not the issue that needs to be discussed here, but I'm just thinking of that. The other area that was lacking, but that I was thinking of, especially in terms of the usage of the different